There's a leather-bound ledger in the Georgia State Archives that most historians refuse to discuss in detail. The pages are brittle now, yellowed with age, but the handwriting is still clear. Plantation sale records from Chatham County, 1851 to 1859. Most entries are routine: a name, an age, a price, a new owner, but one name appears 6 times across those 8 years, and each time there's a notation in the margin that makes archivists uncomfortable. The name is Dina, sometimes spelled Dina or Diana, depending on who kept the records. And the notation, written in 3 different hands across 3 different years, says the same thing in slightly different words. Buyer assumes all risks. Previous incidents disclosed. Price reflects condition and history. What incidents could drop a woman's sale price from $900 to $275 in just 7 years? What history makes 3 separate clerks warn buyers about risk? The answer is buried in court testimonies, doctors' reports, and private letters that survivors tried desperately to destroy. Dina didn't just resist her masters, she ended them in ways so precise, so calculated that physicians across Georgia began comparing notes about injuries they'd never seen before and hoped never to see again. 4 men bought Dina. 4 men tried to do what masters had always done in the darkness of slave quarters when wives were sleeping and witnesses were scarce. And 4 men learned too late that some women would rather die than submit, and that dying wasn't the worst thing that could happen to you. Before we go any deeper into Dina's story, I need to ask you something. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because stories like this, the ones that were deliberately burned, erased, and forgotten, don't surface often. And when you're done, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to know where the truth is finally reaching. Now let's discover what made Dina so terrifying that her owners would rather lose thousands of dollars than keep her another night. The woman who would become Georgia's most dangerous slave was born sometime around 1828 on a rice plantation outside Savannah. Nobody recorded her mother's name. Nobody recorded her exact birth date. She was simply inventory noted in a ledger as one female child approximately 2 years old when the plantation changed hands in 1830. What made Dina different from the hundreds of other children born into those low country? Rice fields wasn't apparent in those early years. She was small for her age, quick with her hands, and quiet in a way that unnerved the overseers. While other children cried when separated from their mothers or punished for minor infractions, Dina watched. Her eyes followed everything: the way the overseer favored his right leg after a horse kicked him, the pattern of the master's Tuesday night inspections of the quarters, which dogs were trained to track and which were just for show. She stored information like others stored food for winter, hoarding details that might prove useful later. Her first master was a man named Thaddeus Whitmore, owner of Sweetwater Plantation, 300 acres of rice fields that flooded twice daily with the tide from the Ogeechee River. Whitmore ran his plantation with mechanical efficiency. He fed his workers adequately because starved slaves couldn't maintain the brutal pace rice cultivation demanded. He punished systematically 20 lashes for tardiness, 40 for backtalk, 75 for running, and he kept meticulous records of everything: yields per acre, cost per bushel, and the breeding potential of his female property. Dina worked the rice fields from age 8, wading through water that reached her chest, planting seedlings in the stinking mud while water moccasins glided past her legs. The work destroyed bodies with democratic impartiality. The constant dampness rotted feet and caused infections that could kill if left untreated. The mosquitoes carried fevers that left workers shaking and delirious. And the sun, reflecting off the water, burned skin even on overcast days. But rice work taught Dina something valuable: patience. In the fields, rushing meant mistakes. Mistakes meant ruined crops. Ruined crops meant punishment. So she learned to move with deliberate precision, to complete each task exactly as required, to never give the overseers reason to notice her. This patience, this ability to wait for the exact right moment, would define everything that came later. Dina was 14 when she learned what masters did in the darkness. One of the older women in her cabin, a woman named Rachel, who'd worked Sweetwater for 20 years, explained it to her in whispers after the candles were blown out. She told her about Tuesday nights when Whitmore made his rounds. She told her about the women who got pregnant and were sold away before the babies came, before Whitmore's wife could count months and ask uncomfortable questions. She told her about the women who resisted and were found floating face down in the rice fields the next morning, their deaths recorded as accidental drownings. And she told her something else, something that most of the women had accepted as inevitable truth. It's going to happen to you eventually. You're getting old enough now. When it does, you got two choices. You can fight and die, or you can go limp and survive. I'm telling you this because I want you to survive." Dina absorbed this information the way she absorbed everything else without visible reaction. But that night, lying on her cornuck mattress, she made a decision that would echo across 8 years and 4 plantations. She would survive, but she would survive on her terms. The assault came on a Tuesday night 3 months after that conversation. Dina had prepared. She'd stolen a sharpening stone from the plantation's toolshed 2 weeks earlier, hiding it in the false bottom of her trunk. She'd taken a straight razor from Whitmore's shaving kit during her rotation cleaning the main house, replacing it with a similar but duller blade she'd found rusting near the stable. And she'd practiced in the darkness of the cabin after everyone else had collapsed into exhausted sleep. She'd traced the movements over and over, where to cut for maximum damage, how much pressure to apply, the angle that would make the difference between an injury that healed and one that didn't. When Whitmore pushed open the cabin door that Tuesday night, Dina was awake. She'd been awake for hours. She watched him move between the sleeping women, his boots barely making sound on the packed dirt floor. She watched him pause beside Rachel's pallet, then move on. She watched him stop above her own thin mattress, his breathing audible in the silence. When his hand reached down and touched her shoulder, she didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She simply waited for him to lean closer to put his weight off balance as he knelt beside her. Then she moved. The motion was fast, precise, and utterly silent. The razor opened his inner thigh where the femoral artery ran close to the surface. Not the groin, which is what he would later claim, but the thigh. The difference mattered. The wound sprayed blood with each heartbeat, soaking Dina's blanket, the floor, Whitmore's trousers. He made a sound, not quite a scream, more like the noise an animal makes when it realizes it's been caught in a trap. Dina stood and walked out of the cabin into the October night, still holding the razor. She didn't run. Running would have been pointless. The dogs would track her before she made it to the river. Instead, she walked directly to the overseer's cottage and knocked on the door with the calm precision of someone delivering an expected message. The overseer, a man named Silas Pope, answered with a pistol in his hand, expecting trouble, but not the kind that stood before him. A 14-year-old girl, covered in blood that wasn't hers, holding a razor and speaking in a voice utterly devoid of emotion. "Master Whitmore is bleeding in cabin 7. He needs a doctor immediately, or he'll die in about 10 minutes. Then she sat down on the porch steps and waited for whatever came next. What came next was chaos. Pope sent a boy running for Dr. Edmund Cross, the only physician within 20 mi. Another slave was dispatched to wake Mrs. Whitmore, though Pope didn't tell her why, just that her husband needed her immediately. And Pope himself went to cabin 7, where he found Thaddeus Whitmore sitting against the wall, both hands pressed to his thigh, his face the color of old paper. The other women in the cabin had woken now, but they didn't help him. They didn't speak. They simply watched with expressions that Pope would later describe in his journal as disturbingly blank, as if witnessing something that held no surprise or concern. Dr. Cross arrived 40 minutes later, by which time Whitmore had lost enough blood to make recovery uncertain. Cross was a practical man who'd spent 15 years treating everything from cholera to gunshot wounds, but even he was impressed by the precision of Dina's cut. In his private notes, later discovered in an attic trunk by his great-granddaughter, he wrote, "The wound was inflicted with remarkable anatomical knowledge. 1 in to the left and it would have been superficial. 1 in to the right and he would have bled out before help arrived. The cut was exactly deep enough and exactly placed to cause maximum damage while leaving time for intervention. Either this was the luckiest accident in medical history, or this girl has knowledge that should terrify every man in Georgia." Whitmore survived, but he was changed. The injury left him with a permanent limp in what Cross delicately termed complications and conjugal matters. In less delicate terms shared between doctors over whiskey, Whitmore could no longer father children, and given the location and nature of the scarring, certain other functions were compromised as well. He spent 6 weeks recovering in his bedroom while his wife Catherine maintained a dignified silence that everyone understood meant she knew exactly what had happened and exactly why. The legal question of what to do with Dina consumed Chatham County for weeks. Georgia law was clear. A slave who attacked a master could be executed. A slave who caused permanent injury to a master should be executed. But the circumstances created complications nobody wanted to address in open court. A 14-year-old girl, a midnight visit to the slave quarters, an injury in a location that told its own story. The county prosecutor, a man named Harrison Webb, was nobody's fool. He understood that putting Dina on trial meant putting Whitmore on trial too. Every detail would become public record. Every newspaper from Savannah to Atlanta would print the specifics, and those specifics would raise questions about how many other masters made similar Tuesday night visits, how many other girls had been forced to choose between submission and violence. Webb offered Whitmore a deal: drop all charges, sell the girl immediately, and the incident would be recorded simply as an accidental injury during discipline. No trial, no public testimony, no uncomfortable questions. Whitmore, humiliated and eager to erase the entire episode, agreed immediately. Dina was sold 3 weeks later to a cotton planter named Marcus Brennan for $850, a price that reflected her age, her strength, and what Brennan called her spirited nature. The sale document included a single additional line written in the clerk's careful script. Buyer acknowledges prior incident disclosed. Price adjusted accordingly. Brennan's plantation lay 60 minutes inland near the town of Milledgeville. The journey took 5 days, chained in a wagon with 7 other newly purchased slaves, watching the landscape change from coastal marshland to red clay hills. Dina spent those 5 days in silence, absorbing details. The way the wagon driver favored his left side when he walked, the loose board in the wagon bed that could be pried up, the pattern of nighttime guard rotations. Information, always information. Marcus Brennan's plantation was larger than Whitmore's. 600 acres of cotton that stretched across rolling hills until the rows seemed to vanish into the horizon. He owned 63 people housed in 12 cabins arranged in 2 neat rows behind the main house. Brennan considered himself a progressive master. He allowed marriages. He permitted Sunday afternoon rest. He even allowed his slaves to earn small amounts of money by selling vegetables from their garden plots. What Brennan didn't advertise, what his wife pretended not to notice, was that his progressive attitude stopped at the cabin doors after dark. Dina spent her first 3 months picking cotton with mechanical efficiency. She wasn't the fastest picker, but she was consistent, 200 pompuelos a day, every day, regardless of weather or exhaustion. She learned the rhythms of Brennan's plantation quickly. The overseer, a thick-necked man named Dutch Crawford, ran the fields with casual brutality. He didn't need to be told twice to use the whip, and he seemed to enjoy his work more than necessary. Brennan himself appeared in the fields twice weekly, riding a gray horse and carrying a ledger, where he recorded yields and noted which workers were meeting quotas and which needed motivation. But it was the nights that revealed the plantation's true nature. Brennan visited the cabins on Thursday evenings, not every Thursday, and not always the same cabin, which made the pattern harder to predict, but often enough that the women developed a rotation system, an unspoken agreement about who would answer the knock when it came. The younger women, those who'd been on the plantation less than a year, were usually spared. Brennan preferred women who understood the rules, who knew that resistance meant worse than submission, who'd learned to disappear inside themselves while their bodies went through motions they'd stopped trying to prevent. Dina watched this system with the same careful attention she brought to everything else. She noticed which women flinched when Thursday approached. She noticed how they volunteered for extra work that would leave them too exhausted to be coherent by evening. She noticed the morning after bruises, the pregnancies that ended suspiciously early, the babies born with complexions that didn't match their recorded fathers, and she understood that her 3-month grace period was ending. She'd been on the plantation long enough now to lose her newcomer protection. The knock came on a Thursday in late February, 1843. Dina was 15 now, taller than she'd been on Whitmore's plantation, but still small, still quiet in that way that made people underestimate her. She'd prepared differently this time. No stolen razor, too obvious, too traceable. Instead, she'd taken something simpler, a 6-in length of wire from the cotton gin's machinery, wound it around a wooden handle she'd carved from a tool handle, and sharpened one end on the same grinding wheel used for hoes and axes. The tool was primitive but effective and, more importantly, untraceable. Wire-broken machinery all the time. Nobody would connect a missing piece to what she carried wrapped in cloth beneath her mattress. When Brennan entered the cabin that Thursday night, Dina was waiting. Not in her bed this time. That had been a mistake with Whitmore, allowing him to get too close before she acted. This time she stood near the door in the shadows, having positioned herself there an hour earlier, while her cabin mates pretended not to notice. Brennan carried a small lantern. He always brought light, unlike Whitmore, who'd moved in darkness. The lantern illuminated 5 sleeping women, their backs turned, their breathing suspiciously even, but it didn't illuminate the corner by the door where Dina stood motionless. Brennan set the lantern on the floor and moved toward the nearest pallet. That's when Dina stepped forward and spoke, her voice low and clear. "Master Brennan, I need to speak with you outside privately." The shock of hearing a voice in what should have been silent submission made him turn. His hand moved toward the pistol he kept in his belt, a reflex born from years of fearing slave rebellion. But Dina's hands were empty, visible in the lamplight. She looked calm, respectful even, her posture suggesting compliance rather than threat. Brennan relaxed slightly. He was curious now, intrigued by this unusual approach. Perhaps this one wanted to negotiate terms, offer herself willingly in exchange for privileges. "It had happened before outside," he said, his voice carrying amusement. "What could you possibly need to discuss that requires privacy?" "It's about my sister," Dina lied smoothly. "She's sick in cabin 4. I need permission to bring her medicine, but I can't ask in front of the others. They'll want the same consideration." The lie was calculated. It gave Brennan a reason to follow her outside, away from witnesses, while making her seem concerned with plantation hierarchy rather than rebellion. He considered for a moment, then nodded. "Make it quick. I have other business tonight." They stepped into the February darkness together. The moon was only a sliver, providing barely enough light to see the path between cabins. Dina walked 3 steps ahead, moving toward the gap between cabin 3 and cabin 4, where shadows pulled like spilled ink. When she reached the darkest point, she turned as if to speak, and Brennan moved closer to hear her. That's when she struck. The sharpened wire entered just below his ribcage, angled upward toward the liver. Not the heart, which was protected by bone and hard to reach. Not the lungs, which would cause immediate visible distress. The liver, an organ that when punctured caused internal bleeding that could take hours to kill. Plenty of time to separate herself from the crime. Brennan made a sound like air escaping from a bellows. His hand clutched at his side, finding the wound, the wire still protruding. Dina stepped back out of reach and spoke in that same calm voice. "You should go to your house and call for Dr. Cross. Tell him you fell on a piece of machinery in the gin house. If you tell him what really happened, everyone will know you were visiting the cabins at night. Everyone will know why. Your wife will know. The whole county will know." Then she walked away, not to her cabin, but to the gin house itself, where she spent the next 20 minutes deliberately creating evidence. She broke a section of wire from the machinery. She knocked over tools. She scattered cotton fibers across the floor in a pattern suggesting someone had stumbled. She even smeared her own blood drawn from a deliberate cut on her palm on one of the sharp edges. When the overseer came looking for her an hour later, he found her sleeping in her cabin, her hands dirty from field work, but showing no obvious signs of involvement. Brennan told the story exactly as Dina had instructed. A late-night inspection of the gin house, checking on reports of mechanical problems, a stumble in the darkness, a fall onto broken machinery. The wire had punctured deep, he said, but he'd managed to pull it out and walk back to the house. Dr. Cross arrived before dawn. He examined the wound with growing suspicion. The angle was wrong for a fall. The depth suggested deliberate force rather than accidental contact, and the location just below the ribcage, hitting the liver with precision that required either impossible luck or anatomical knowledge. He kept these observations to himself, though his journal entry that morning noted, "Second suspicious injury in 2 years involving precision wounds to vulnerable organs." Brennan's explanation defies medical logic. The wound was inflicted by someone who knew exactly where to strike. Brennan survived, but barely. The liver damage caused complications that left him weak and jaundiced for months. He never returned to the fields, never resumed his Thursday evening inspections. His wife, Eleanor, took over plantation management with an efficiency that suggested she'd been waiting for this opportunity. And after 6 months of recovery, when Brennan could finally speak to visitors without exhaustion, he did something unexpected. He didn't accuse Dina publicly. Instead, he sold her. The sale price was $625, significantly less than he'd paid. The notation in the margin written by a different clerk in a different county said, "Buyer advised of previous difficulties. Sale price reflects concerns about temperament and history of incidents." The buyer was a man named Samuel Cord, owner of a tobacco plantation near Augusta. Word was spreading now through the network of plantation owners who gathered in town squares and courthouse steps to trade information. They didn't discuss Dina by name in public. That would require acknowledging what had happened. And acknowledgement meant admitting the visits, the assaults, the system of nocturnal control that everyone knew existed, but nobody mentioned in daylight. Instead, they spoke in code. "That girl from Brennan's place," one would say. "The one with the difficulties." Another would respond, nodding knowingly. "Heard she's been sold again. Third time now. Fourth, actually. Started with Whitmore down in Chatham County. Someone should warn Cord. Someone did. He bought her anyway. Said he doesn't anticipate problems." Samuel Cord was different from Whitmore and Brennan in ways that made him more dangerous. He was educated, having studied law at the University of Georgia before inheriting his family's tobacco plantation. He was thoughtful, known for reading philosophy and attending Presbyterian services every Sunday, and he was convinced that the problems other masters had experienced with Dina resulted from their own failures of character and discipline. A well-managed plantation, he believed, had no need for nocturnal violence or forced submission. Order and respect flowed from consistent rules fairly applied. Dina arrived at Cord's plantation in September 1843. Now 16 years old and carrying a reputation that both preceded and protected her. The other slaves knew her story, or versions of it, the details growing more dramatic with each retelling. She'd killed 2 masters. Some said she'd cut 3. She'd escaped 4 times and been caught each time. The truth was obscured by mythology, but the core message was clear. This was a woman who chosen violence over submission and survived the choice. Cord's plantation ran with mechanical precision. Morning bell at 5. Work assignments distributed by his overseer, a former school teacher named Josiah Williams, who managed through exhaustive record-keeping rather than physical punishment. Meals served at exact times, evening curfew at sunset. Punishments were rare but systematic. Extra work for tardiness, reduced rations for poor performance, isolation for insubordination. It was a humane system by the standards of the time, which meant it was still brutal but less overtly violent than most. Dina adapted to this environment with her usual careful observation. She worked the tobacco fields with quiet efficiency, learning the delicate process of harvesting leaves at precisely the right moment of ripeness. She attended Sunday services where Cord read from Scripture and explained how the social order reflected divine will. She kept her head down, her thoughts private, her hands busy. For 8 months, nothing happened. Cord never visited the cabins at night. He never called women to the main house for private conferences. He maintained strict boundaries between master and property, treating his slaves with the same detached professionalism he might apply to livestock, valuable, requiring proper maintenance, but fundamentally different in category from human relations. Dina began to wonder if she'd finally found something approaching safety. Then Cord's wife died. Eleanor Cord succumbed to tuberculosis in May 1844 after a 3-month decline that left her skeletal and barely conscious at the end. The funeral was well attended. Cord accepted condolences with stoic dignity. The plantation continued operating without interruption, but something in Cord had broken in a way that wasn't immediately visible. He began spending more time in his library, drinking whiskey, and reading the same passages from Marcus Aurelius over and over. His Presbyterian faith, always somewhat academic, became even more abstract. He stopped attending services, stopped supervising the fields, stopped maintaining the careful boundaries that had defined his management style. Williams ran the plantation now, while Cord isolated himself in the main house, wrestling with grief and something darker than grief. It was a Tuesday night in late June when Cord finally emerged from his isolation. He was drunk, something his slaves had never seen before. He carried a lantern and a pistol, and he moved through the darkness toward the cabins with unsteady steps. Dinah, sleeping lightly as always, heard him coming, the crunch of boots on the path, the muttered words he was saying to himself, too quiet to understand but loud enough to serve as warning. She was already awake and dressed when he pushed open her cabin door. This time would be different. Cord was armed. He was unstable and he was operating from grief-driven desperation rather than calculated control. Dina's usual strategies, the calm voice, the suggested alternatives wouldn't work here. She needed something else. What happened next would be described by 3 different witnesses in 3 different ways, all contradictory, all probably partially true. Cord entered the cabin. He set the lantern down. He raised the pistol and demanded Dina come with him to the main house. She refused. He grabbed her arm. She pulled away. He struck her with the pistol. She fell. Then, in the moment when he leaned down to grab her again, she did something that witnesses struggled to articulate clearly. One woman said Dina had a knife. Another said it was broken glass. A third insisted it was just Dina's hands moving so fast they seemed to blur in the lamplight. What everyone agreed on was the result. Cord staggered backward, both hands clutching at his face. Blood poured between his fingers. He was screaming now, a high-pitched sound that brought people running from every cabin. When Williams arrived with 3 other men, they found Cord on his knees, blood pooling around him, and they found Dina standing against the cabin wall, her right hand bleeding from cuts that suggested she'd used glass as a weapon and injured herself in the process. Dr. Cross, summoned for the 3rd time in 3 years to treat injuries inflicted by the same slave, arrived to find Cord's condition more complex than simple cuts. Dina had targeted his eyes, not blinding him completely, Cross noted, but damaging the right eye severely enough that vision was permanently impaired. She'd also opened deep gashes across both cheeks, wounds that would scar dramatically, ensuring Cord would carry visible evidence of this encounter for the rest of his life. In Cross's journal, the entry was longer this time, more detailed, tinged with something approaching fear. 3rd incident involving the slave called Dina. The pattern is now undeniable. Each injury is precisely calculated for maximum damage without causing death. Each wound targets areas that will permanently alter the victim's life, their capability, their appearance, their function. This is not rage. This is not random violence. This is systematic surgical destruction of the men who attempt to assault her. I have written to colleagues in Savannah and Charleston asking if they have encountered similar cases. I fear we are witnessing something unprecedented, a form of resistance so calculated and effective that it threatens the entire foundation of our labor system. If other slaves learn these techniques, if this knowledge spreads, we face a crisis more dangerous than any rebellion. The legal response to Dina's 3rd incident was swift and unprecedented. Samuel Cord, despite his injuries, appeared before the county magistrate 2 days after the attack and demanded immediate prosecution. But Cord made a critical mistake. In his grief and rage and humiliation, he told the truth. He described going to the cabin at night. He described his intentions. He described everything that plantation owners had spent decades pretending didn't happen. The magistrate, a practical man named Thomas Rutledge, who'd presided over hundreds of property disputes, sat in uncomfortable silence as Cord's testimony unraveled the careful fiction everyone had agreed to maintain. When Cord finished speaking, Rutledge asked a single question. "Mr. Cord, are you telling this court that you went to the slave quarters after midnight, armed with a pistol, with the intention of forcing this girl to accompany you to your residence?" Cord, still too angry to recognize the trap, answered, "I went to exercise my legal rights over my own property. What I intended is irrelevant. She attacked me. That's the crime." Rutledge made notes in his ledger, his face carefully neutral. Then he said something that would be repeated in plantation houses across Georgia for months. "Mr. Cord, I'm deeply sympathetic to your injuries. However, prosecuting this case would require entering your testimony into public record. Every newspaper from here to Savannah would print the details. I strongly advise you to consider whether pursuing legal remedies serves your interests or whether alternative solutions might prove more satisfactory." The alternative solution was the same as always. Sell her immediately, accept the financial loss, move forward without acknowledging what had really happened. But this time, finding a buyer proved difficult. 3 previous incidents, 3 injured masters. Dina's reputation had evolved from whispered warnings to explicit widespread knowledge. Plantation owners discussed her openly now, sharing information, warning each other away from what they called the Georgia problem. The price continued to drop. $850 to Brennan, $625 to Cord. Now Cord was offering her for $400 and still finding no buyers. Finally, a broker from Charleston arrived with an unusual proposal. He represented a buyer who understood the risks and was willing to pay $350. The buyer's name was Elijah Vance, owner of a small cotton farm in the western part of the state near the Alabama border. Vance's reputation preceded him. He was known as a harsh master, someone who'd bought and broken difficult slaves before. He used isolation, deprivation, and systematic psychological pressure to crush resistance. If anyone could handle Dina, the broker suggested, it would be Vance. Court accepted immediately. The sale was finalized in August 1844. The notation in the margin of the bill of sale was longer this time, more explicit. Buyer fully informed of 3 previous violent incidents resulting in permanent injury to prior owners. Buyer acknowledges all risks. Price reflects significant concerns about safety and temperament. Seller disclaims all liability for future incidents. The journey to Vance's farm took 6 days. Dina traveled alone this time, chained in a wagon driven by the broker and his assistant. They didn't speak to her except to give orders. Didn't ask questions, didn't try to touch her. The fear was palpable, and Dina recognized it as the closest thing to power she'd ever possessed. These men, who held her life in their hands legally, were terrified of her physically. It was a small victory, but she stored it away with all the other information she'd collected over the years. Vance's farm was smaller than any plantation Dina had seen before. Only 80 acres of cotton, worked by 11 people living in 3 cabins. The main house was modest, barely larger than an overseer's cottage on the plantation she'd known. Vance himself was a wiry man in his 40s, with graying hair and eyes that never seemed to blink. He examined Dina the way someone might examine a dangerous animal, maintaining careful distance, evaluating weaknesses. "I know what you did," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "I know how you did it. And I know why you did it." He paused, letting this sink in. "Here's what's going to happen. You'll work the fields like everyone else. You'll sleep in cabin 3 with the other women. You'll eat the same food, work the same hours, follow the same rules, and I will never, under any circumstances, come near you after dark. Not because I'm afraid of you, but because I have no interest in what you're protecting. You understand?" Dina nodded slowly. This was unexpected. "But understand this too," Vance continued. "If you cause any trouble, any violence toward me or my overseer or anyone on this property, I won't have you arrested, I won't have you tried. I'll have you shot like a rabid dog and buried in an unmarked hole. No court, no questions, just done. We're far enough from town that nobody asks questions about dead slaves. Am I clear?" Dina spoke for the first time since arriving. "Yes, master." "Good. Now get to work." For 6 months the arrangement held. Vance kept his word. He maintained absolute distance, conducting all interactions in daylight with witnesses present. His overseer, an elderly man named Peter Commies, managed the daily operations with weary efficiency. The work was brutal, the food barely adequate, the living conditions harsh. But there were no night visits, no threats, no hands reaching out in darkness. Dina began to believe she'd found something approaching equilibrium. She was wrong. The problem wasn't Vance, it was his brother. James Vance arrived in February 1845, traveling from South Carolina to spend several months helping Elijah expand the farm. James was younger, louder, more confident. He'd heard about Dina, found the stories amusing rather than cautionary. At dinner, his first night, sitting with Elijah and Commies, James raised the subject directly. "So, this is the famous slave who cuts her masters. She doesn't look like much." Elijah's response was sharp. "Leave her alone, James. That's not a suggestion. That's an order. I'm not afraid of a girl with a knife, Elijah. You've gotten soft in your old age." "I'm not soft. I'm practical. She's property that loses value if damaged, and I lose value if damaged by her. The arrangement we have works. Don't disturb it." But James wasn't interested in his brother's careful arrangements. He saw Dina as a challenge, a problem to be solved, proof that he was tougher and smarter than the men she'd injured before. He began watching her during fieldwork, making comments just loud enough for her to hear. Testing boundaries, measuring reactions, Dina recognized the pattern. She'd seen it before. Men who convinced themselves that the previous incidents had been flukes, mistakes made by weaker men who didn't know how to handle difficult property, men who believed they could succeed where others had failed. The assault came on a Wednesday night, not a traditional visiting night, which was probably deliberate. James had been drinking. He entered cabin 3 without a lamp, moving in darkness, confident in his ability to navigate by moonlight through the single window. But Dina wasn't in her bed. She'd been sleeping outside for the past week, ever since James arrived, lying on the ground behind the cabin where she could see anyone approaching. When James entered and found her pallet empty, he made a sound of frustration and turned to leave. That's when Dina stepped into the doorway behind him, blocking his exit. "You should go back to the main house," she said quietly. "Your brother told you to leave me alone." James spun around, his hand moving toward the knife on his belt. But Dina had already moved. She didn't have a weapon this time, didn't need one. Years of cotton picking had made her hands strong. Years of waiting for the right moment had made her fast. And years of studying anatomy through trial and horrible error had taught her exactly where to strike. The details of what happened next were never fully documented. James stumbled out of the cabin 3 minutes later, collapsed in the yard, and began screaming for his brother. When Elijah arrived with a lamp, he found James curled on the ground, both hands pressed to his groin, blood seeping through his fingers. Dina stood in the cabin doorway, her hands empty, her expression calm. "He didn't listen to you," she said to Elijah. "I warned him." "You warned him. He came anyway." Dr. Cross wasn't called this time. James refused, insisting he'd be fine, that it was just a minor injury, but over the following days, it became clear the damage was severe. James developed a fever. The wound, wherever it was, became infected. By the end of the week, he could barely walk. Elijah, furious at both his brother and Dina, finally summoned a local physician named Dr. Warren Hughes. Hughes examined James in privacy, then emerged looking shaken. His report to Elijah was brief and clinical. "The injury is consistent with a precise, forceful strike to the testicles. One has ruptured completely. The other is severely damaged. Your brother will recover, but he will never father children. The infection is treatable, but the underlying damage is permanent." Elijah Vance understood immediately what this meant. 4 masters now, 4 injuries, 4 men permanently altered by a girl who shouldn't have had the knowledge or capability to defend herself so effectively. The pattern was undeniable and terrifying. That night, Elijah did something unprecedented. He sat in his library and wrote a letter to every plantation owner within 50 mi. The letter was detailed, explicit, and brutally honest. He described each incident he knew about: Whitmore, Brennan Cord, and now his own brother. He explained the nature of the injuries, the precision of the attacks, the pattern that suggested systematic knowledge rather than lucky accidents. And he posed a question that no one had dared ask publicly. "Gentlemen, we face a situation that threatens the stability of our entire labor system. This slave has developed techniques for permanently injuring men who attempt to assault her. She has survived 4 separate encounters, each time avoiding death through precise calculation of how much damage to inflict without crossing the line into capital punishment. But here is what should concern us most. She is not unique. If one slave can develop this knowledge, others can learn it. If these techniques spread through the female population, we lose one of the fundamental mechanisms of control we have relied upon for generations. I propose we meet to discuss how to address this situation before it becomes a widespread crisis." The letter caused exactly the reaction Elijah anticipated and feared. Within 2 weeks, 23 plantation owners had responded. Some dismissed his concerns as paranoia. Others shared their own stories of difficult slaves who'd shown unusual knowledge of anatomy. A few reported rumors of women teaching each other defensive techniques, passing information through the same networks used to share news and maintain family connections across separated communities. A meeting was organized for March 1845 at the courthouse in Augusta. 27 men attended representing plantations across Georgia, South Carolina, and Alabama. They met in closed session with guards at the doors to prevent eavesdropping. The discussion lasted 6 hours. Some argued for immediate execution. Dina had proven too dangerous to live regardless of legal niceties, set an example that would discourage others from following her path. Others argued for sale out of state, making her someone else's problem. A few suggested studying her techniques, understanding how she had acquired this knowledge, then developing countermeasures. But there was one voice that changed the conversation entirely. Dr. Edmund Cross, now 63 years old and retiring from practice, attended as an observer. He treated 3 of Dina's 4 victims. He documented the injuries in journals that were becoming increasingly valuable to medical researchers, and he had a theory he'd been developing for 3 years. "Gentlemen," Cross said when given the floor, "you're asking the wrong questions. You want to know how to stop this one woman? You should be asking why this woman exists in the first place." The room fell silent. Cross continued, "I have examined dozens of female slaves over my career. Examined them after assaults, after injuries, after incidents their masters preferred to keep quiet, and I have seen patterns that should disturb any man with a conscience. These women develop knowledge of anatomy because they must. They learn to defend themselves because we have created a system where defense is their only option. Dina didn't emerge from nowhere. We created her every Tuesday night visit, every forced encounter, every pregnancy that resulted in a child being sold away. We created the necessity for women like her to exist, and now we're shocked that they do." The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Several men stood to leave. Others called for Cross to be removed, but a few, a significant minority, stayed seated and listened. Cross pressed his advantage. "You can kill this one woman. You can sell her. You can pass laws making it illegal to teach anatomy or self-defense, but you cannot erase the knowledge she represents. It's already spreading. Other women are learning, and they're learning because we have given them every reason to learn. If you want to solve this problem, you don't eliminate the women who defend themselves. You eliminate the necessity for defense. The meeting ended without consensus. No formal action was taken, but Cross's words circulated through Georgia's plantation community like a slow-acting poison, raising questions that couldn't be easily answered or dismissed. Some masters did change their behavior, establishing stricter boundaries, ending nocturnal visits. Others doubled down, increasing surveillance and punishment to crush any signs of resistance before they could develop. And a very few, began quietly working towards something resembling reform, though they'd never used that word publicly. As for Dina, Elijah Vance faced an impossible situation. He couldn't keep her. The risk was too great, especially with his brother demanding revenge. He couldn't execute her without trial, which would mean publicly acknowledging what James had been attempting, and he couldn't sell her. After 4 incidents, no one would buy her at any price. So, he did something that surprised everyone, including Dina herself. He freed her. The Manuum mission papers filed in March 1845 cited irreconcilable differences in temperament and included a clause forbidding Dina from remaining in Georgia. She was given $75 a year's wages for skilled labor and papers declaring her a free woman on the condition that she leave the state within 30 days and never return. If this moment haunts you, if you're feeling the weight of what women like Dina endured, then this channel needs your support. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Hit that like button to push this into more people's feeds. And if you haven't subscribed to The Sealed Room yet, do it now because we're committed to bringing you the stories that history tried to erase. The ones that make us uncomfortable, the ones that force us to confront the truth. Now, let's discover what happened when Dina walked into freedom and whether freedom was enough after everything she'd survived. Dina left Georgia on March 15, 1845, carrying her Manuum mission papers, $75, and knowledge that made her simultaneously valuable and dangerous. She traveled north, avoiding main roads, sleeping in churches and boarding houses that catered to free black travelers. She was 17 years old. She'd survived 4 plantations, she'd permanently injured 4 men, and she'd done something that no one, including herself, had fully understood until now. She'd become a symbol. Word of her story had spread through slave communities across 3 states, passed along in whispers and coded songs. Women who'd never met her knew her name, knew Clear's throat, what she'd done, knew that resistance was possible, that submission wasn't inevitable, that certain knowledge could level the vast power imbalance between master and slave. Dina settled initially in Philadelphia, where a community of free black residents had established neighborhoods, churches, and mutual aid societies. She found work as a seamstress, rented a small room above a bakery, and tried to build something approaching a normal life, but normally proved elusive. Women sought her out. They came at night in secret asking questions. How had she known where to cut? How had she learned anatomy? How had she survived legally when the system was designed to crush resistance? Dina answered their questions with the same calm precision she'd brought to everything else in her life. She didn't encourage violence. She didn't preach rebellion. She simply provided information. Where major blood vessels ran close to the surface, which injuries were temporarily debilitating versus permanently damaging. How to create the appearance of accident or self-defense. How to navigate legal systems designed to deny your humanity while using the contradictions within those systems to your advantage. Within a year, Dina had taught 17 women. Within 2 years, the number grew to 43. She didn't keep records, didn't document names, but others did. Abolitionists working in Philadelphia began noticing patterns. Enslaved women who escaped north seemed to possess unusual knowledge. Several incidents occurred in Maryland and Virginia where masters were injured under circumstances that seemed oddly familiar, and rumors reached Philadelphia that plantation owners were comparing notes trying to understand why female slaves were suddenly defending themselves with unprecedented effectiveness. In 1847, 2 years after Dina's arrival in Philadelphia, something unexpected happened. A delegation of plantation owners from Georgia, South Carolina, and Virginia traveled north to meet with federal authorities. They brought documentation, court records showing patterns of injuries, medical reports describing wounds too precise to be accidental, and testimony from dozens of masters claiming that female slaves were becoming increasingly difficult to control, increasingly knowledgeable about human anatomy, increasingly willing to use violence in self-defense. The delegation demanded federal intervention. They argued that this represented organized resistance, possibly insurrection, coordinated by agitators in northern cities. They named Dina, specifically presenting her Manna mission papers as proof that she'd been released into free states where she could spread dangerous knowledge. Without legal consequences, the federal response was complicated by politics and law. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 required northern states to return escaped slaves, but Dina wasn't escaped property. She'd been legally freed. Teaching self-defense wasn't explicitly illegal, even if the knowledge being taught was disturbing to those who relied on complete submission. And prosecuting her would require masters to testify publicly about why they feared this knowledge, which meant acknowledging the nocturnal assaults that polite society pretended didn't exist. Federal marshals did investigate. They interviewed Dina in her Philadelphia boarding house, a conversation that was later documented by a marshal named Robert Chenoweth, whose private journal survived in family archives. According to Chenoweth, Dina was cooperative, calm, and utterly unrepentant. She answered every question directly, Chenoweth wrote. Yes, she had injured 4 men in Georgia. Yes, she taught other women anatomy and self-defense. No, she didn't consider this rebellion or insurrection. When I asked her to explain the distinction, she said something I'll never forget. Rebellion means trying to overthrow a system. I'm just teaching women how to survive within it. If the system finds survival threatening, perhaps the problem isn't the women who want to survive. I had no legal grounds to arrest her. Her manumission papers were legitimate. Teaching anatomy isn't a crime. And honestly, after hearing her story, after understanding what she'd endured, I wasn't certain I wanted grounds to arrest her. The federal investigation concluded without charges, but it had consequences. Dina's name became more widely known. Abolitionist newspapers published accounts of her story, sometimes accurate, often embellished. Pro-slavery publications condemned her as evidence of northern corruption, claiming that freed slaves inevitably became dangerous and uncontrollable. And in slave communities across the South, her name took on mythical qualities. She became larger than her actual self, transformed by repetition and need into a symbol of resistance that women could invoke even if they'd never met her. But Dina herself was struggling. The attention was dangerous. Slave catchers operated in Philadelphia despite it being a free city, kidnapping black residents and claiming they were escaped property. Dina had papers proving her freedom, but papers could be stolen or destroyed, and her notoriety made her a target. In May 1848, 3 men attempted to kidnap her from her boarding house. They claimed to be federal marshals with a warrant, but their paperwork was obviously forged. Dina recognized the trap immediately. She didn't fight. Fighting would give them justification to use force, possibly kill her, and claim self-defense. Instead, she screamed, loud, sustained, the kind of noise that brought neighbors running and made kidnappers nervous about witnesses. The men fled. Dina wasn't harmed, but the incident made clear that Philadelphia wasn't safe anymore. She needed to move farther north, somewhere less accessible to Southern interests. In June 1848, Dina relocated to a small town in upstate New York near the Canadian border. She chose the location carefully, close enough to Canada to escape if necessary, far enough from major cities to avoid attention, small enough that strangers were noticed, which made kidnapping attempts more difficult. She found work with a Quaker family, the Whittams, who owned a dry goods store and had abolitionist sympathies. They knew her history, they'd read about her in newspapers, and they offered her not just employment, but protection, a room in their home, an introduction to the local free black community. For 3 years, Dina lived quietly. She worked in the store. She attended the African Methodist Episcopal Church every Sunday. She taught reading and basic arithmetic to children in the black community, using the literacy she'd acquired by watching plantation owners' children decades earlier. She seemed to be building the normal life that had eluded her in Philadelphia. But she hadn't stopped teaching. Women still found her. They traveled from Pennsylvania, from Ohio, from as far south as Maryland, carrying letters of introduction from people Dina had taught in Philadelphia. They came asking for the knowledge that might save their lives or the lives of their sisters and daughters still enslaved. And Dina taught them not in formal classes or organized sessions, but in quiet conversations, in demonstrations using fabric and thread to illustrate anatomy, in careful explanations of where blood vessels ran and which organs could sustain injury without causing death. She also began documenting everything. Using her hard-won literacy, Dina wrote detailed accounts of her own experiences and the experiences of the women who came to her. She recorded patterns of assault, legal strategies that had worked, techniques of resistance that had proven effective. She created, in essence, a manual for survival. The documents were stored with the victims who understood their historical value even if they were terrified of the legal implications of possessing them. One section of Dina's writings preserved in the Witham family papers and later donated to a historical society provides insight into her thinking during this period. I have been asked many times if I regret the violence I used, the men I injured, the lives I altered. My answer is always the same. I regret that violence was necessary. I don't regret defending myself. Every woman who comes to me asks the same questions. How do I protect myself? How do I survive? How do I maintain some small piece of humanity in a system designed to strip it away? I teach them what I learned through trial and terror. I teach them so they don't have to learn the way I did. And I document everything so that someday when this evil system finally collapses, people will know the truth. Not the sanitized version that slave owners tell their children. Not the mythology that pretends masters were benevolent and slaves were content. The truth that women fought back, that resistance took many forms, that survival itself was an act of defiance. In 1851, the Fugitive Slave Act was strengthened, making it easier for slave catchers to operate in northern states and harder for free black residents to prove their status. The new law required citizens to assist in capturing suspected fugitives and imposed penalties for those who harbored or aided escaped slaves. The law created panic in free black communities. Many fled to Canada, others armed themselves. Some, like Dina, prepared for the possibility that legal freedom might not be enough protection. The Whittams, understanding the increased danger, suggested Dina cross into Canada. It was safer. The British had abolished slavery decades earlier, and Canada didn't recognize American fugitive slave laws, but Dina refused. If I run to Canada, she told Mrs. Wickham, then every woman who needs to learn what I can teach has to travel farther to reach me. Some won't make it. Some will be caught trying. I stay until staying becomes impossible. That moment came in September 1851. A slave catcher named Cyrus McDaniel arrived in town with papers claiming Dina was escaped property from a South Carolina plantation. The papers were fraudulent, obviously, though they listed her age incorrectly, described physical characteristics that didn't match, and bore signatures from people who'd been dead for years. But under the new Fugitive Slave Act, commissioners received fees for certifying captures, creating incentive to overlook inconsistencies. McDaniel arrested Dina at the Whittam store on a Thursday afternoon. He shackled her hands and began walking her toward the wagon he'd left at the edge of town. He didn't make it 20 feet. The free black community had been watching McDaniel since his arrival. They'd recognized him as a slave catcher, had warned each other, had prepared for this possibility. When he arrested Dina, 12 men and 6 women converged on the street. They weren't armed, didn't need to be. They simply surrounded McDaniel and Dina, forming a human barrier that prevented movement in any direction. "You're not taking her," one man said. His name was Samuel Brooks, a free carpenter who'd escaped slavery 15 years earlier. "Those papers are fake. Everyone knows it. You're kidnapping a free woman." McDaniel drew a pistol. "Step back or I'll shoot." Nobody moved. They stood there in silence, blocking the street, making it impossible for McDaniel to proceed without violence that would attract more attention. After 10 minutes of standoff, the town sheriff arrived. His name was Thomas Milford, and he was in an impossible position. The Fugitive Slave Act required him to assist in captures. But the evidence that Dina was the person named in McDaniel's paperwork was thin to the point of absurdity, and shooting free black residents to enforce a questionable warrant would cause problems that extended beyond his jurisdiction. Milford made a decision that probably saved Dina's life. "Mr. McDaniel, I'm going to need to verify these papers with federal authorities before proceeding. The discrepancies in age and description require clarification. I'll hold the alleged fugitive in county custody until we receive confirmation." McDaniel protested furiously. This was federal business. The commissioner had already certified the papers, but Milford was unmoved. "The prisoner will remain in county custody pending verification. You're welcome to file a complaint with the federal court." Dina spent 3 days in the county jail while telegrams traveled back and forth between New York and federal offices in Washington. The Wickhams hired a lawyer. The free black community raised money for legal fees. Abolitionist organizations sent representatives to observe the proceedings, and newspapers across the North picked up the story, turning Dina's case into another flashpoint in the growing national conflict over slavery. The federal response, when it finally came, was political rather than legal. Someone in Washington recognized that prosecuting Dina would require explaining who she was and why slave catchers were so eager to capture a woman who'd been legally freed 6 years earlier. It would mean testimony about the four masters, the injuries, the pattern of resistance that threatened plantation control. Better to let this one go. The official response stated simply that the paperwork contained insufficient evidence to verify the identity of the person named in the capture warrant. Dina was released. McDaniel left town threatening to return with better documentation, but he never did. And Dinah, understanding that she'd used up her luck, finally agreed to cross into Canada. She settled in a town called Chatham in southwestern Ontario, where a thriving community of escaped and freed slaves had established farms, businesses, and schools. She was 24 years old. She'd survived 17 years of slavery, 4 near-fatal confrontations, a kidnapping attempt, and legal proceedings that could have ended with her return to bondage. She worked in Chatham as a seamstress and teacher, known in the community as a quiet woman who occasionally helped other women with what people carefully described as private medical matters. She never married, never had children, kept to herself except when women needed the knowledge she carried. The Canadian years were Dina's longest period of stability, but they were also years of increasing isolation. The violence she'd survived had left scars that weren't visible, but were nonetheless real. She had nightmares, had difficulty trusting people, especially men, had periods of depression where she couldn't work or interact with others for days at a time. A letter written by a friend in Chatham, a woman named Mary Parker, describes Dina during this period. She is kind to everyone but close to no one. She lives alone and seems to prefer it that way. Sometimes I see her sitting by her window at night, just staring out at nothing. When I asked her once what she was thinking about, she said she was remembering the women in the cabins, the ones who didn't survive, who didn't fight back, who disappeared into the system and were never heard from again. She carries their ghosts with her. I think they weigh more heavily than the men she injured. In 1857, Dina became ill. The symptoms started gradually. Fatigue, weight loss, a persistent cough that wouldn't resolve. By August, she was bedridden. The local doctor, a Scottish immigrant named Andrew Fraser, diagnosed consumption, what we now call tuberculosis. There was no effective treatment. Fraser could only make her comfortable and wait for the inevitable progression. Dina died on October 12, 1857, at age 29. She was buried in the Chatham Cemetery in a section reserved for the Black community. Her gravestone, paid for by community donations, bore simple inscription, Dina, born in bondage, died in freedom. She fought. The local newspaper published a brief obituary that mentioned she'd been a seamstress and teacher, but made no reference to her history in Georgia. That story was too controversial, too complicated, too uncomfortable for public acknowledgement. But in other places, in churches and community centers and private homes where formerly enslaved people gathered, Dina's story continued to circulate. Her name was invoked by women teaching their daughters about survival and resistance. Her techniques documented in the writing she'd left with the Whitehams and other abolitionists were studied and shared. And her fundamental message that submission wasn't inevitable, that women could defend themselves even within systems designed to make defense impossible. That message survived her by decades. The 4 men Dina injured lived out their lives in varying degrees of obscurity and regret. Thaddeus Whitmore. I sold his plantation in 1852 and moved to Charleston, where he lived alone until his death from a stroke in 1869. His estate inventory listed assets worth less than a third of what he'd owned before that Tuesday night in 1842. Marcus Brennan II remained on his plantation but never fully recovered from the liver damage. He died in 1861 just before the Civil War reached Georgia, having watched his world begin to crumble. Samuel Cord III never remarried after his wife's death. The scarring on his face made him self-conscious, reluctant to appear in public. He spent his final years increasingly isolated, drinking heavily, dying of cirrhosis in 1863. James Vance, the 4th and final victim, returned to South Carolina and lived another 30 years, but he never spoke publicly about what happened in that cabin in Georgia. When asked about his inability to father children, he claimed it was the result of a writing accident. Nobody believed him, but nobody challenged the lie either. The archive Dina created, the documents she'd written during her years in New York, survived multiple attempts at suppression. The Whitehams protected them during Dina's lifetime, then transferred them to abolitionist organizations after her death. Some materials were published in anti-slavery newspapers, others were preserved in historical societies. A significant portion was deliberately destroyed by people who believed the information was too dangerous, too explicit, too threatening to public morality. But enough survived to ensure that Dina's story wasn't completely erased. In 1889, a historian named Sarah Bradford published a comprehensive study of female resistance during slavery. The book titled Women Who Fought included a chapter on Dina based on the surviving documents. Bradford's analysis was careful and scholarly, but she didn't shy away from the violence or the sexual assault that had prompted it. The book caused controversy. Southern reviewers condemned it as Northern propaganda. Some Northern reviewers criticized it for dwelling on unsavory details. But it sold well and went through multiple printings, suggesting that readers were hungry for stories that complicated the simple narratives they'd been taught about slavery. One section of Bradford's book proved particularly influential with later historians. Dina's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the system we claim to have abolished. The violence she used was extraordinary, but it was extraordinary only in its effectiveness, not in its necessity. Thousands of women faced the same threats she faced. Most had no choice but to submit. Dina found a choice, created a choice through knowledge and courage, and a willingness to accept the consequences of resistance. We can debate whether her methods were justified, but we cannot debate whether the threats she defended against were real and pervasive and systematically ignored by a society that preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. By the early 1900s, Dina's story had been largely forgotten by mainstream culture. The lost cause mythology was gaining strength, rewriting the history of slavery into something softer and more palatable. Stories of resistance, especially violent resistance, especially resistance by women, didn't fit the preferred narrative. But in Black communities, particularly among women, Dina's name survived. She was remembered in oral histories, in stories passed from grandmothers to granddaughters, in quiet conversations about survival and self-defense that continued across generations. In the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement, researchers working on oral history projects began encountering references to Dina. The details were often confused, mixed with other stories transformed by decades of retelling, but the core narrative remained. A woman who'd fought back, who'd survived, who taught others to survive. These references prompted renewed academic interest. Historians began searching archives for documentation. They found court records, medical reports, sale documents, and eventually portions of Dina's own writings. A more complete picture emerged of who she'd been, what she'd done, and why it mattered. In 1974, a historian named Margaret Washington published what remains the most comprehensive academic study of Dina's life. Washington's book, Surgical Resistance: One Woman's War Against Slavery, used newly discovered documents to reconstruct Dina's story with unprecedented detail. Washington argued that Dina represented a form of resistance that had been systematically erased from historical memory because it was too threatening, too successful, too difficult to incorporate into comfortable narratives about the past. The book won awards and sparked renewed interest in women's resistance during slavery. But it also generated criticism from scholars who argued that focusing on exceptional cases like Dina distorted understanding of how most enslaved people survived. These critics had a point. Dina was extraordinary. Most women couldn't do what she did. Most didn't have her knowledge, her courage, or her willingness to accept the risks that came with violent resistance. But Washington's counter-argument was equally compelling. We study exceptional cases not because they are typical, but because they reveal possibilities that ordinary circumstances obscure. Dina shows us that the system wasn't as absolute as it pretended to be. That resistance was possible even in circumstances designed to make resistance impossible. That women found ways to defend themselves despite laws and customs that denied them any right to self-defense. Her exceptionality doesn't make her irrelevant. It makes her essential for understanding the full range of human response to oppression. Today, Dina's grave in Chatham, Ontario, is marked with a newer stone erected in 1995 by a coalition of women's organizations and historical societies. The inscription is longer now, more explicit about who she was and what she did. Dina, born into slavery circa 1828, died free October 12, 1857. She defended herself against assault with courage and knowledge. She taught other women to survive. She documented resistance so the truth would outlast the lies. Her fight continues in every woman who refuses to accept violence as inevitable. The stone attracts visitors now. Women make pilgrimages to Chatham to stand at this grave and remember a woman who lived almost 200 years ago but whose struggle feels contemporary, urgent, relevant. Because the questions Dina's life raised haven't been fully answered. How do we understand resistance that uses violence in self-defense? How do we judge actions taken in desperate circumstances by people with no legal protection? How do we balance the horror of the violence Dina inflicted against the horror of the violence she was defending against? These questions don't have simple answers. They resist the comfortable moral conclusions we prefer. Dina was not a simple hero or a simple villain. She was a woman who made impossible choices in impossible circumstances. She survived through knowledge, courage, and a willingness to do things that most people couldn't imagine doing. She taught other women to survive, understanding that survival itself was a form of resistance in a system designed to break spirits along with bodies. And she documented everything, leaving behind a record that forces us to confront truths we'd prefer to forget. The system that created the necessity for Dina's violence is gone now, destroyed by civil war and legal emancipation. But its echoes persist in the ways we talk about violence and self-defense, in the questions we avoid about assault and power and who has the right to protect themselves, in the stories we tell and don't tell about the past. Dina's story is uncomfortable because it should be uncomfortable. It forces us to sit with moral complexity. It denies us the luxury of simple judgments. It reminds us that history isn't a collection of clue-cut lessons, but a series of impossible situations where real people made real choices with real consequences. 4 men bought diner, 4 men tried to do what masters had always done, and 4 men learned that submission wasn't inevitable, that some women would fight back regardless of consequences, that the system they trusted to protect them had created its own most dangerous enemy. Dina died at 29 in a foreign country, far from the places she'd known, carrying scars, both visible and invisible. But she died free. And she died knowing that the knowledge she'd shared would outlast her, that other women would learn from her example, that the archive she'd built would survive to tell a truth that powerful people wanted buried. In the end, maybe that's the most important part of her story. Not the violence, though. That's what people remember. Not the trials or the escapes or the dramatic confrontations, but the documentation, the patient, methodical work of writing down what happened, preserving the truth, ensuring that future generations would know that women like her existed, fought, survived, and refused to be erased from history. What do you think about Dina's story? Do you believe her actions were justified given the circumstances she faced? How should we understand resistance that uses violence for self-defense in systems that offer no legal protection? And what does it mean that her story was almost completely erased from official history, surviving only in fragments and whispers? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I want to know how this story hits you, whether you think she was a hero or something more complicated than that simple label allows. If this story affected you, if it made you think about things you've never considered before, then subscribe to this channel right now. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Hit that like button to make sure stories like this reach the people who need the most. Because history isn't just about what happened. It's about what we choose to remember, what we choose to forget, and why those choices matter. See you in the next. 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 See you in the next.